He was 6'6" and built like a barn that had decided to walk around. He owned a cattle ranch, 3 water rights, and the only working well on the south side of the valley. He had buried 1 wife already, and on the day he rode into town and shook Lena's father's hand, she didn't even know what he was there for. She only found out 3 days later, standing barefoot in the yard, wringing water from a worn-out shirt, that she had already been traded. But here's the part nobody expected. When he finally stood across from her, the first thing he did was ask her a question. And it was the last question she ever expected a man like that to ask. This channel is built on stories from the heart of the West, where size means nothing, silence says everything, and love shows up in the most unexpected, undecorated ways. The lesson: the most powerful men aren't the ones who take. They're the ones who stop, look at you like a person, and ask what you want. Like this video. Drop your city below. I read every comment. Share it with someone who needs to hear this kind of story today. And subscribe, because we have more coming.
The day they told Lena Voss she was getting married, she was standing out back of her daddy's feed store, barefoot in the dirt, wringing the water out of a shirt so thin you could read a newspaper through the elbows. That New Mexico's sun was beating down something fierce, and the air was thick with dust the color of old blood. She was 22 years old, built like a sparrow, but with eyes that did not miss a thing. She had hair the color of sunburnt wheat and a stubborn jaw that set hard whenever she ran up against something she did not like. Lena had been running up against things for as long as she could remember, like the endless drought, the mountain of debt, and the way men in Calera Flats would talk right over a woman like she was a piece of furniture. But no disagreement had ever hit her quite like this one. Her father, Emmett Voss, stood on the back porch, clutching his hat and staring at his own boots. He said the words flat with no prettying them up and without the decency to look her in the eye. Harlan Cade offered to wipe the slate clean on the store's debt, Emmett mumbled. Every single penny, everything we owe Brixton's bank. And in return, he is looking for a wife. Lena went completely still, the damp shirt hanging limp from her hands. She had known the name Harlan Cade her entire life, the same way you know about a coming storm, a thing that is huge and headed your way, and there is not a blessed thing you can do to stop it. Harlan was 41 years old, stood 6'6", and was built like a stone smokehouse. He owned that big cattle ranch just east of town, held 3 different water rights, and had the only decent well in the entire Southern Valley. He had put 1 wife in the ground already, a timid woman named Dora. Folks whispered she just sort of withered away like a flower left out in the heat too long. No one could ever say he was a cruel man, not with any proof. He was just big and sure of himself, and had spent a lifetime getting exactly what he wanted. And you said yes to him, Lena stated. It was not a question. Emmett finally lifted his gaze, and she saw it clear as day in his eyes. It was not guilt, not quite. It was something far worse than that. It was relief. The decision was already made. The deal was done. She was the horse being traded, and he was looking at her like a man who had just set down the heaviest load of his life. The feed store had been bleeding money for 3 long years. The drought starved out the farmers could not pay their bills, and that took everything else down with it. Lena knew the figures by heart. She had been doing the bookkeeping since she was 16. She knew the debt was not a joke. She knew Brixton's bank had already mailed 2 notices just that month. Still, she had held on to a sliver of hope. She truly believed her father would figure something else out, simply because she was his daughter, and because that was supposed to count for something in this world. It is a fine match, Emmett said, the words falling like rocks between them. He is a man with property. You will not have to worry about a thing. Lena let the wet shirt fall into the dust. She did not toss it. She just opened her hand and let it drop. The way you let go of something when you just cannot find the will to hold it anymore. She walked right past her father, making sure not to brush against him, and went through the back door. She moved through the feed store with its stacks of grain sacks and the familiar smell of dust and animal salt. Then she walked out the front door and onto the main drag of Calera Flats. The town was so small she could see all of it from that one spot. There was the saloon, the telegraph office, and the church with its leaning steeple. The road stretched east, heading out to Harlan Cade's ranch. As she stood in the bright morning heat, she finally understood. Her whole life had just been traded away for a price she was never told and never asked for. Back in the feed store, Emmett Voss dropped onto a sack of grain and buried his face in his hands. He told himself it was the only choice he had. He told himself Lena was a strong girl. She would figure it out. She always did. He told himself Harlan Cade was a decent man. He repeated these things to himself like a man saying a prayer he did not really believe. But underneath the relief, below the simple math of his debts, a sharp sliver of shame was digging itself in deeper every time he said it. He had 3 sons and 1 daughter, and he had given away the daughter. He had decided to call that love. Calera Flats had a long memory, the kind that could snag you when you least expected it. The town remembered M.T. Voss from before the drought, back when he was a man with broad shoulders who laughed without effort, and who kept his store so tidy you could have had a picnic on the floor. It remembered his wife, Clara, who a fever took when Lena was just 9 years old, leaving the family off-kilter in a way that never fully righted itself. Emmett raised 4 children on his own after that, and the town gave him credit for it, the way you give a man credit for walking away from a bad wreck. But credit and respect are 2 different things. The town had watched from the sidelines as the store sank into the red, and as Emmett's laughter grew thin and then disappeared completely. So when he struck his deal with Harlan Cade, most of Calera Flats was not the least bit surprised. People find all sorts of ways to survive. For Emmett Voss, survival looked like a man willing to sell something that was never his to begin with. Lena's 3 brothers were Cass, Ford, and the baby Trick, which was short for Patrick, though no one had called him that since he was a 5-year-old. Cass, at 26, already had a wife and a small patch of dry ground north of town he was trying to coax a vegetable garden out of. Ford was 24 and worked over at the livery stable, moving with the quiet focus of a man who got along better with horses than with people. Trick was 17 and still had that raw look of a boy who had not quite figured out what kind of man he was going to be. All 3 of them found out about the deal the same way Lena did after it was already done, from a father whose explanation already had the apology mixed right in. That left no real room for anger to take hold. Cass just clamped his jaw shut and said nothing at all. Ford headed to the stable and skipped supper that night. Trick was the only one who marched right down to Lena's room and rapped on her door. When she pulled it open, he just stood there, his jaw working as if he were chewing on angry words he could not manage to say. He had no right, Trick finally choked out. Lena leaned on the doorframe, looking over her youngest brother. He had their mama's eyes, a light green, set far apart, and filled with emotions he did not quite know how to handle. No, she agreed quietly. He surely did not. A heavy silence hung in the air between them, full of things neither of them knew how to say. Trick stared down at his worn-out boots. "What are you going to do?" he asked. And Lena, who had passed the entire afternoon just sitting on the edge of her bed and staring at the wall, who had examined every possible choice with the sharp mind of a woman who had kept ledgers since she was a girl, Lena said, "I am going to marry him." Trick's head snapped up. "But I am going to marry him," she said again. "And I will do it with both eyes wide open. And I will find my way through this." She said it soft, with no fuss, like someone laying out a plan they had already promised themselves they would survive. Harlan Cade had come by the store 3 days before the news broke, and Lena had watched him through the front window, having no idea why he was there. She had noticed then, just as she always did, how the doorway seemed to get smaller the moment he stepped through it. He was not an ugly man. That was the hard part. He had a square, sun-beaten face and gray eyes that were watchful, but not mean. He also moved with the slow, careful purpose of a man who had spent his whole life being that big in a world made for smaller folks, and had learned to be mindful of the space he took up. He had talked with her father for 40 minutes behind the closed door of the back office. As he left, he tipped his hat to Lena through the window. She had not realized at that moment that he was tipping his hat to the woman he planned to marry. The engagement was made public during the Sunday service. When Pastor Gideon read a little note that Emmett Voss had scribbled on a piece of brown paper, the good people of Calera Flats listened with that polite, sideways kind of attention that folks use when they are gathering up gossip to talk about later. Lena sat in the third row, her hands folded neatly in her lap, and her spine ramrod straight. She did not look at a single person, not even when she could feel every eye in that church on her, like ants finding a drop of honey. After the service, the women of the town swarmed her, their congratulations all wrapped up in their nosy questions. Mrs. Brixton, the banker's wife, took Lena's hand in her own and said, "Harlan Cade is a man of considerable means, my dear." She said it as if that one fact settled everything, as if that was the answer to a question no one had even bothered to ask. Lena just smiled, because a smile was easier than trying to explain anything. Harlan Cade's ranch was called the Ironwood. It was situated at the far eastern edge of the valley, looking like something that had been there forever and planned on staying forever. The main house was built out of dark wood and stone they had hauled up from a creek bed 30 miles to the south. It had a big, wide porch that looked out at the mountains, and a roof so well built that in all its years, not one single leak had found its way through. The inside was spotless, which honestly threw Lena for a loop when she saw it for the first time. She figured she would find the kind of mess a man makes living alone for years, with dishes piled high and rugs full of dust. But the house was neat, just a little empty. There were not many decorations. A rocking chair sat by the fireplace, showing the smooth marks of long use. A line of books was on a hallway shelf, and they looked like they had been read, not just put there for show. In the kitchen, a pot of something was simmering on the stove, smelling of sage and slow cooking. Harlan met her at the gate when she rode up, with Trick right behind her, who had insisted on coming and now sat on his horse like a guard dog made of pure, stubborn love. Harlan had tipped his hat as she got closer, a polite gesture that felt a little strange in the big old quiet of the land all around them. He seemed even bigger out in the open, with no walls to measure him by, just the sky and the grass and the huge silence of the valley. "Miss Voss," he said. His voice was low and steady, like a man who had taught himself to speak softly so he would not accidentally boom. Lena swung down from her horse without any help and looked right up at him, because she always stared straight at the things that scared her. It was the only real shield she had against being afraid. "Mr. Cade," she said, "I want to see the house before I say yes to living here." He took her through every single room. He answered all her questions straight, never dodging them or cutting her short. When she asked about where they got their water, he walked her out to the well. When she asked who the nearest neighbor was, he pointed and told her the distance. And when she asked, and she had to ask, what his first wife died from, he got very still. Then he said, real quiet, that Dora had a sickness in her lungs for 2 years before she passed. He said the doctor down in Santa Fe had called it consumption, and that he had spent every last penny he had trying to stop it. There was no act in how he said it, just the plain, heavy truth of a thing he had to live with. Lena looked at him for a good long moment, and then she just nodded. She did not say she was sorry. She had a feeling he had heard the word sorry so many times it did not mean anything anymore. She also saw a cradle in the second bedroom at the end of the hall. It was empty, and it looked like something that had not been touched in a long while, but had been kept perfectly clean. She did not ask about it. Some things are so clear that asking questions would just be cruel. She tucked that detail away. That small wooden cradle, sitting in a room that smelled a little like cedar and loss, and she kept it in her mind. On the way back to the porch, where Trick was leaning on a post, looking like he did not trust a single thing, Harlan Cade offered them both some coffee. Trick said no. Lena said yes. The three of them sat on that porch in a triangle of stiff silence, while the mountains in the distance turned the color of a new penny in the evening light. And Lena thought, this place needs something alive in it. She just was not sure if she wanted to be that living thing. The ride back to town was quiet for a while until Trick said, "For a big fella, he has got kind eyes." Lena just glanced over at her brother. "That does not mean a thing," she said. "It might mean something," Trick shot back with that stubborn wisdom of a young man. Lena kept riding without a word for another quarter of a mile, watching the last bit of sun dip behind the mountains, listening to the dry wind rustling the grass on both sides of the road. "He was not the one who chose the debt," she finally said. "Daddy chose the debt. Harlan Cade just chose to pay it." She said it like she was sorting out facts and putting them in their proper boxes, which is exactly what she was doing. Because Lena Voss, who had been keeping the family books since she was 16 and had seen the numbers go bad for years, understood one thing better than anything else. Being clear-eyed was the only thing of value she had left. They got married on a Thursday in October, when the sky was that deep, clean blue you only see in New Mexico after the first cold snap of fall has wiped all the haze away. The service took place in the church with the lopsided steeple, and it was quick because Lena had asked for it to be quick. Pastor Gideon said the words he was meant to say. Harlan said what he was meant to say, in his low, careful voice. Lena said what she was meant to say in a voice that did not shake one bit because she had made up her mind, as a point of pride, that she was not going to put on a show of sadness for a crowd that was half there for pity and half there to gawk. She wore her mother's dress, taken in to fit her smaller body, with a line of tiny buttons up the back that Trick had fastened for her that morning with his clumsy, loving fingers. The dress had been white at one time. It had faded to an ivory color over the years, which Lena thought felt more honest. Emmett Voss cried during the ceremony. He stood right there in the front row and cried with the loud, simple sorrow of a man who had talked himself into believing his own guilt was proof of his love. Lena did not look at him. She looked at Harlan Cade, who stood at the altar with his hands by his sides, big, still hands, with knuckles scarred from a lifetime of hard work, and he was watching her with a look she could not quite figure out. He looked, she thought, like a man who knew he had been given something he had not fully earned, and who was not quite sure how to hold it. That something was more careful, something that, if you looked at it just right, almost seemed like respect. After the wedding, they had a small gathering in the churchyard. Mrs. Brixton had put it all together, which meant there were tablecloths, cold chicken, and a cake that looked a lot better than it tasted. People ate and talked in that cautious way people do at an event they are not sure how to feel about. Cass stood with his wife, Nell, over by the fence, not talking to anybody. Ford had come, and that was a surprise to Lena. He stood off by himself with a glass of lemonade he was not even drinking, just studying Harlan Cade with the sharp look of a man judging a horse he was not sure about. Trick stayed close to Lena the whole afternoon, so close she could feel the heat from his body, and he never stopped scanning the crowd, like he was expecting trouble to just pop up right in the middle of it all. It was Nell, Cass's wife, who pulled Lena aside near the end of it all, squeezed her hand and said in a low voice, "You do not have to pretend with me." Lena looked at her. Nell was a smart woman, sharp and with dark hair, who had walked into her marriage with Cass with her eyes wide open, and had never looked like she regretted it. "I am not pretending," Lena said. "I am managing." Nell watched her for a second and then gave a slow nod. "There is a difference," she said. "I know," Lena said. And she really did know. Pretending was acting out a feeling you did not actually have. Managing was building a life when you did not have all the parts you had hoped for. Lena had been managing things since she was 9 years old, when her mother left and never came home. And she was not about to stop now. The wagon ride out to the Ironwood Ranch at the end of the day was the most peculiar part. They sat right next to each other on the wagon seat. Lena had her mother's ivory dress bunched up around her knees. Harlan was driving the horses with the easy skill of a man who had been holding reins since he was a boy. The sun was setting right in front of them, painting the road in shades of orange and red. They did not say a word for the first mile. Then Harlan said, without even looking at her, "I know this is not what you would have picked." Lena thought about that for a moment. "No," she said. "It was not." Then there was more silence. "I will do right by you," he said. It was not a grand promise. It was just a simple statement of what he planned to do. The kind of thing a man says when he means it, but does not know how to prove it yet. Lena kept her eyes on the road ahead and did not say anything. Inside her chest, a knot that had been pulled tight all day, loosened just a tiny bit, like a rope given, like a quarter-inch of slack. The first few weeks at the Ironwood were like a quiet agreement made without any words. Harlan would get up before the sun and come in from the range after it set, and all the time in between was filled with the ranch, a whole machine of cattle and fences and water troughs and hired men that took up all his attention. He was not mean. He was not exactly warm, either. But he was not mean. He made space for her in the kitchen without her having to ask. He did not ask her to cook or clean like it was her job just for being a woman, but more like it was part of their arrangement. Instead, he did those chores right beside her, quietly, and without expecting anything, as if they were just two people sharing a house and sharing the work that the house needed. It was not the terrible thing Lena had been afraid of, but it was not what she had hoped for either, in that secret part of her heart where hope still grew no matter what. As stubborn and quiet as grass growing through cracks in a stone, she learned things about him the same way you learn about a new place, slowly, just by being in it. He read books in the evenings, sitting in that worn-out rocking chair by the fire, with a lamp pulled in close and his large body hunched over the book in a way that seemed almost apologetic, like he was embarrassed to be taking up so much room. He liked silence more than small talk. But when he did talk about something he cared about the land, the livestock, and how the water was getting scarcer each year, he talked about what that was doing to the whole valley. And he spoke with a quiet, steady focus that just wasn't what she figured would come from a man his size. She'd been expecting a man who was rough and direct. Instead, she found a sharp and thoughtful mind. It surely didn't change how she'd ended up there, but it tangled up the simple story she'd been telling herself about him. About a month later, she stumbled on Dora's belongings in a trunk up in the cedar room. She wasn't snooping. She was just looking for an extra blanket since the nights were biting with cold. But that old trunk, it was unlocked, and the moment she lifted the lid, she knew exactly what she was looking at. There was a dress, a hairbrush, and a little Bible with a woman's name penned in a fine flowing hand. And tucked underneath all that was a set of baby clothes, folded neat, and never once worn. Lena just sat there on the floor of that cedar room for a good long while, with the open trunk right in front of her. The quiet old house had just given up its first big secret. Dora had been carrying a child when she passed away. That cradle in the other room suddenly felt different, like it held a sorrow that was heavier and, well, more real than just some vague sadness. She never said a word to Harlan about what she found. She just shut the trunk, walked back to the kitchen, and got supper on the stove. And when he walked in from the fields, she saw him in a whole new light. It was the way you might look at a stranger after you've accidentally read their private journal. It wasn't judgment exactly, just the heavy feeling of knowing too much, way too soon. And he saw it in her face. He noticed because under all that quiet and calm, he was a man who saw everything. "Something the matter?" he asked her. "No," she replied, handing him a mug of coffee. He took it and studied her for another moment before letting it be. He had learned, and she was starting to see, that letting things be was one of the main rules he lived his life by. 2 weeks after that, on a bitter cold night when the wind was just screaming across the plains and making the windows rattle, Harlan came in late. He sat down hard at the table and made no move for his supper. Lena watched him from the other side of the room. His face was doing something she had never seen before. It was unguarded, like a gate someone had left wide open. "Lost a couple of calves today," he finally said. The cold snap came on too quick. He said it flat, just stating a fact. But his hands were gripping the edge of that table so hard his knuckles were white. Lena came and sat down across from him. She didn't say she was sorry. She had a gut feeling that he had heard the word sorry so many times it didn't mean anything to him anymore. She had thought it before, and she was thinking it again now. So instead, she just said, "Tell me what we need to do." "Tomorrow." He just looked at her, and something in his expression seemed to settle. "I'll show you," he said. EMT Voss rode up to the Ironwood Ranch on a Tuesday in November. He was on a horse he'd borrowed because his own had pulled up lame. He wore the face of a man who'd been practicing a speech in his head for weeks, and still knew it wasn't right. Lena saw him coming from the porch. She was fixing a fence rail, a job she hadn't planned on. But it needed doing, so she was doing it. She put her tools down and just waited. She didn't walk out to meet him. She made him come all the way to her, because she needed those extra few seconds to smooth all the feeling out of her face. She had not said one word to her father since the day of the wedding. She hadn't realized until that very moment, standing on the porch of a house she was just beginning to understand, how deep that wound still was. He swung down from the horse with the stiff movements of an old man trying to act young, and he stood at the bottom of the steps, holding his hat in his hands. She noticed he always did that, twisted that hat in his hands when he had something hard to say, like it was the only thing holding him to the ground. And he said, "Lena, I've got to ask you something." "You should have asked me things before," she said. The words were quiet, but they cut deeper than any shouting ever could. He flinched. "I know it," he said. I know, but asking now." She just waited. He told her Ford had been let go from the livery stable. He said Brixton had called in the rest of the loan on the store, the part Harlan's money hadn't covered. "There was another loan I didn't tell you about." Lena froze solid. "Another loan," she said, her voice flat. The amount he named wasn't much to men who owned ranches and held water rights, but for a failing feed store with nothing coming in, it was like standing at the edge of a cliff. EMTT stood there in the chilly air and laid it all out with the frantic detail of a man who's held his tongue for too long, and now it was all coming out in a rush. This second loan had been taken out 2 years back, before Lena was keeping the books, back when EMT kept thinking the drought was bound to break and business would turn around. It never did. He'd just pushed that debt to the back of his mind, telling himself he'd handle it, right up until the bank sent one letter, and then another, and then the final notice. Lena heard the whole sorry story without saying a word. When he was finally done, she said, "You married me off to settle a debt, and you didn't even tell the man the full price." The hope just collapsed right out of Emmett's face, and it was a terrible thing to watch. Not because it wasn't fair, but because he had earned every bit of it. "I thought Harlan's payment would be enough to cover everything," he mumbled. "You thought," Lena said, and those 2 words slammed a door shut between them for good. She turned and walked back inside. She stood in the kitchen for a second with her hands pressed flat on the table, just breathing through the rage, counting it down like she'd learned to do with columns of figures when the numbers made her want to break something. Then she went to the desk in the corner and pulled out a pen and some paper. She was writing when Harlan walked in. "Bank loan," she said, without any preamble. "Bank loan," she repeated, not even looking up from the page. "It's not a fortune, but it's not nothing either. He came to ask if you'd take care of it." She put down her pen. She finally looked at him. "I'm not asking you to do it," she said, making her voice real clear. "I want to be plain about that. I'm telling you because you've got a right to know the whole mess you married into." What you decide to do is your own business." Harlan was quiet for a long stretch. His gray eyes went from her face to the paper on the desk and then back again. "What do you want me to do?" he asked. And Lena, who never expected that question, who had braced herself for a man who would just make up his own mind, she felt something give way inside her chest again. It was that same shift she was starting to think of as dangerous, because it meant she was actually starting to trust him. "I want you to be mad at him," she told him. "I can take care of the rest." Harlan rode down to Calera Flats by himself the next morning. He left early, before the town had even had its first cup of coffee. He stopped at the bank first. Lena only knew because Trick told her. Trick, who had a knack for being in the right place at the wrong time, had been at the general store when Harlan came through. He'd quietly trailed him from a distance, feeling protective of his sister and holding on to a complicated kind of respect he was building for the man she'd married. Harlan walked into the bank. He was in there for about 11 minutes. When he came out, he headed straight for the feed store. MT was just opening up for the day, and Harlan stood there in the doorway and spoke to him. Trick, who was watching from across the road, said later he couldn't make out the words, but he saw his father's face turn white as a sheet in the first 30 seconds. Here is what Harlan said to Emmett Voss. He told him he had paid off that second loan. He had paid every last cent, with no strings attached and no haggling. But before he did, he'd had Brixton at the bank draw up a piece of paper, a formal accounting, all signed and witnessed, that spelled out the entire history of the store's debt. It included the loan EMTT had hidden from Lena and from Harlan himself. He had the bank make up 3 copies of that document. Harlan kept one for himself. He mailed another one to Cass, Ford, and Trick so Lena's brothers would know the whole truth about what their father had and had not done. And he carried the 3rd copy to the store and handed it right to Emmett. Harlan believed a man needed to hold the paper that listed his own choices in his own 2 hands. "I'm not doing this for you," Harlan told Imtit. Trick couldn't hear him, but Lena heard it later from her father. He came to the Ironwood 3 days later, standing on the porch and looking smaller than she'd ever seen him. "I'm doing it because your daughter is my wife," Harlan had said, "and she does not need to be carrying the burdens you made." Then Harlan said one last thing, still in that quiet, level voice that never had to be loud because it always meant business. "You don't go to her with money troubles again, you hear me? Not ever. You come to me first, and I'll decide if we're going to have a talk." Empty, he just stood there and took it because what else could he do? The man was right. Lena heard all about it on Friday night when Harlan came home and sat across the supper table from her and just told her. He told her plain, the way he told her everything, with no extra words, just laying out how it all happened. He watched her face the whole time he was talking, and when he finished, he just waited. Lena sat there, her hands wrapped around her coffee mug. The fire was crackling behind her, and the sound of the wind outside made the little house feel solid and warm. "You didn't have to go and do that," she said softly. "No," he agreed. "I didn't." He paused. "Do you wish I hadn't?" She thought on it for a moment. She pictured her father's face on the porch, twisting his hat. She thought about that written record, that formal accounting, and her brothers finally holding the plain truth in their hands. "No," she said. "I'm glad you did." That was the truest thing she had spoken to him. Later that night, she walked to the end of the hall, opened the door to the cedar room, and just stared at the cradle for a good long while. She had been thinking about Dora more than she let on, even to herself. She thought about the tiny baby clothes packed away in the trunk, and about Harlan building this entire house with the kind of care a man takes when he plans on filling it with a family. And then, after watching that dream wither on the vine, she did not step inside. She stayed right there in the doorway, looking at that cradle, and what she felt was not pity. She had figured out early on that pity was not a thing Harlan Cade needed from her or anybody else. No, it was something closer to heartache, the kind of specific ache you feel for another person. It was like seeing an old hurt in a place before you ever got there, a wound in the floorboards you learned to walk around. She pulled the door closed softly. She went back to the kitchen, poured another cup of coffee, opened a book, and slowly started to make a life inside that house. It was Trick who came bearing trouble, the way the youngest brothers often do. It was not from being careless, but from the raw courage of a man who had not yet learned that some truths need to sit a spell before being spoken out loud. He rode out to the Ironwood one Sunday in December and found Lena in the stable, brushing her horse down. He just stood there in the stable doorway, his shoulders all tight and his hat shoved back on his head, and said, "I've got to tell you something about Cass." Lena just kept on brushing. "Then tell me," she said. What Trick told her was this. Cass had paid a visit to Brixton's bank 2 weeks before Harlan's second payment was due. He did not go to ask a question. He went to make a deal. He offered Brixton a piece of his own land, that dry northern plot he had been working if the bank would call in Harlan's entire debt right then and there. Lena stopped brushing. The horse blew out a long breath and shifted its feet. He wanted the bank to call in the debt, she said, before Harlan could pay it off again. Trick just nodded, his face a picture of misery. Brixton turned him down flat, said the land was not worth nearly enough and there were problems with the deed anyway. But Cass... Trick trailed off. "He what?" Lena asked, her voice very quiet. "He went and told Harlan's hired man, the one named Vetch, that the Ironwood's east fence line was crowding onto public grazing land, which it is not. I have seen the survey myself. But Vetch went and told the county assessor, and now there is a big question mark sitting on Harlan's eastern boundary. It will not stick, but it is going to take time and a whole lot of money to sort out." Lena put the brush down. She stood right there in the middle of the stable, with the cold December air slipping through the wooden planks, and her horse's warm breath on her shoulder. "Why?" she asked. It was not a real question. She already had the answer. Cass was the oldest brother, the one who was supposed to be able to fix anything. He had stood by and watched his own father use his sister like a bargaining chip. And instead of that anger pointing at his father where it belonged, it had bent. It was the way anger can get twisted in folks who just cannot stand to hate the person they are supposed to love. So it shot sideways and aimed itself right at Harlan. If Harlan lost some respect, if his money got tangled up, if he looked a little less steady, then maybe the marriage would fall apart. Maybe Lena would come home. It was the thinking of a man who could not undo what was already done. So he was trying to tear down a future that scared him, a future where his sister belonged to someone else completely. It was a twisted, small-minded thing to do, and it had done real harm, all of it born from a kind of love that smothers you. She told Harlan that evening. She was done with the idea that she could protect her family by keeping secrets from her husband. That was a bad road, and she had seen exactly where it led. Harlan listened, and then he got quiet in that way he had when he was wrestling with something that took all his strength not to lash out at. His jaw was set hard. His hands were laid flat on the tabletop. She watched him hold himself perfectly still and thought, that is what a man looks like when he knows his own temper and has chosen to be bigger than it. "He needs to fix it," Harlan finally said. "The business with the assessor." "Yes," Lena said, "he does." "I will not be the one to go to him," Harlan said. "That is for you to deal with, if you are willing. But it has to be dealt with." "I know," Lena said. She rode over to Cass's place the next morning all by herself, without telling a soul she was leaving. It was early and cold, with frost still clinging to the grass, and her breath puffed out in little clouds before her. Cass met her at the gate, which meant he must have seen her coming, and she could tell by the look on his face that he knew she knew. She swung down from her horse and stood there holding the reins and looked at her oldest brother. This was the man she had grown up trailing after, the man who had taught her how to ride a horse, how to set a fence post straight, and how to read the clouds for a coming storm. And she said, "You are going to ride to the county assessor's office today and tell him you made a mistake." Cass just stood there, his hands shoved deep in his coat pockets, his eyes fixed on the frozen dirt. "And if anything like this ever happens again," Lena said, "I will be done with you for good." She said it with no anger at all, just with pure clarity, like a clean, sharp line drawn by a woman who had finally found her own ground and had no intention of losing it. The blizzard hit that January with almost no warning. In less than 2 hours, the sky turned from clear and quiet to a storm of white. By the time Harlan understood just how bad it was getting, 3 of his hired men were already out on the East Range. They were with a small herd that had drifted down toward the dry creek bed. He rode out after them himself, without telling a soul, because that was the kind of man he was. He was a man who rode toward trouble because the land and the livestock were his to look after. In all his years, he had never once turned his back on that duty. Lena watched him ride away from the porch. She saw the snow slowly erase him. First his edges blurred, then his whole shape. Then there was only the sound of his horse's hooves, and then silence. The wind howled, so she went back inside to watch from the window. Something broke open in her chest, a feeling she had not been expecting. She was afraid. This was not the vague, managed fear she felt standing barefoot in the dirt the day her father announced the marriage. This was a real, sharp fear. It was the kind of fear a person feels when they have something they do not want to lose. She stood by that window for 20 minutes as the storm got worse. The air grew colder and the big pine trees in the yard bent over like they were being punished. And then she quit standing at the window. She went out to the stable and saddled her own horse. She was not a fool. She knew that riding into a blizzard by yourself was the exact kind of choice that got people killed in New Mexico in January. She also knew that Harlan had gone by himself because he did not want to risk anyone else. That was the thinking of a man who had been carrying every burden alone for so long. He had plain forgotten he had another choice. She found him down at the creek bed, which she could do because she knew this land now. She had learned it the same way she had learned everything else piece by piece, because she had to. He was there with 2 of the hands, all 3 of them fighting in the screaming white wind to shove the cattle back toward the ranch. One of the hands had his horse down. The poor animal had broken through a thin sheet of ice over a ditch and could not get its legs back under it. Harlan was there with a rope, along with the other man, and they were straining something awful in the bitter cold. Lena rode right in without a word and went straight to the head of the fallen horse. She took its bridle and spoke into the animal's ear, low and steady, just like she had been doing with scared animals since she was a little girl. The horse heard her. Its breathing calmed, and on the very next pull it found its footing. They made it back to the ironwood just as the last gray light was fading into darkness. The hands went on to the bunkhouse. Harlan saw to the horses. Lena went into the kitchen and built the fire back up and put a pot of water on to boil. She noticed her hands were shaking. It was a strange thing, like watching a part of your own body do something you never told it to do. When Harlan finally came inside, he was caked in snow. His face was chapped raw, and his coat was dark and stiff with ice. He stopped dead in the doorway and just looked at her. "You came out there," he said. "Yes," she said. She set a cup on the table and turned to look right at him. A quiet fell between them that was different from all the other silences they had shared. It was not the quiet of 2 strangers getting used to a house, but the quiet of 2 people who have just come through something hard together and are still feeling the weight of it. "I was scared," she said, "when you left." The words did not come easy, but she said them anyway. He crossed the kitchen in 3 long steps. Everything Harlan did seemed to cover ground fast. He sat down at the table and looked at her with those gray, watchful eyes. She realized then that he had been watching her from the very beginning with something she had refused to put a name to. "I would have come back," he said. "I know," she said. "I went anyway." And then, because she was Lena Voss, a woman who did not leave important business unfinished, she added, "I want to open the cedar room. I want to bring the cradle out. I am not saying paused, searching for the right words. "I am not saying right away or even soon. But I want to take it out of that room and bring it into the house proper, because a house with a locked room is a house that is still hurting, and I want this one to heal." Harlan just looked at her for a long, quiet moment. His big hands were folded on the table. His face had that open look on it again, like a door someone had left unlocked. "All right," he said. His voice was quiet, steady, like a man who had just been given back something he had given up all hope of ever having again. March eased into the valley, the way good things sometimes do when you have been waiting without being sure. Not in a rush, but bit by bit. One so small you would hardly see it until you looked back and saw how much ground you had covered. The snow melted off the porch first, then it disappeared from the yard, and finally from the field nearest the house. The warmth seemed to rise from the earth like it had been waiting patiently all winter and was now finally ready. Lena started a small garden for the kitchen along the south wall of the house. She had been thinking about it since November, using seeds she had ordered from a catalog and kept in a tin on a shelf. One Saturday morning, Harlan appeared with lumber, nails, and a level. Without a word, he spent the day on his knees in the soil, measuring and cutting with the quiet focus of a man building something that meant more than it looked. EMTT came to visit in April. He rode his own horse this time, which was now recovered. He arrived in the afternoon when the light was soft and golden, and new grass was starting to show in the pasture. Lena went to meet him at the gate. She knew this talk was coming. Some talks you can feel on the wind, like the air changing right before a storm. She had gotten ready for it, not by rehearsing her words, but by choosing how she wanted to feel. She wanted to feel like a person who had moved on, not forgiven. Forgiving was too big a thing for one afternoon, but moving on was possible. EMTT stood there at the gate, holding his hat in his hands. He looked older and smaller than she remembered. Not physically smaller, but smaller in the way men get when the world has changed the story they tell about themselves. He said, "I should have found a different way." Lena just nodded. "Yes," she said, "you should have." He said, "I keep thinking about your mother, what she would have said." Lena let the silence hang for a moment. "She would have said the same thing I am saying," Lena told him, and she would have said it a lot louder. For just a second, the ghost of a smile might have crossed EMTT's face. It did not stay long. "Are you?" he began to ask. "Yes," Lena said, cutting him off because she knew the question. "Are you okay? Are you making it? Did you survive?" The answer to all of them was the same. "I am all right," she said. "I need you to know that. I need you to know that I am truly and completely all right. Not because I am forgiving you right now, but because I built a life for myself in spite of everything." She said it with a clear voice, not crying, just telling the simple truth. Trick was visiting every week now. He had started making himself useful on the ranch, the way a young man with a lot of energy and no set plans will do. He tightened what was loose, rode out to check on fences, and helped with the heavy work in the early morning. Harlan paid him a fair wage and treated him like a grown man. Trick, who had not always been treated that way, accepted it with a mix of quiet pride and thankfulness that was touching to see. Ford had come by twice. Both times he just stood on the porch with a glass of lemonade he never touched. On his second visit, he looked right at Harlan and said, "You kept your word." His tone was both a statement and an apology for doubting him before. Harlan just said, "I planned on it." And that was all that needed to be said. Two men, two short sentences, and they understood each other. On a warm evening near the end of April, Lena stood on the wide porch of the Ironwood Ranch. She looked out over the valley as the mountains turned gold and purple in the setting sun. The cattle were moving slowly and peacefully in the lower pasture. The first little green shoots were starting to come up in her kitchen garden. Harlan came out and stood next to her, and she knew it then. It was a thing she had known for some time without saying it, that she was glad he was there. Not just there, glad. The difference was important. She had learned the space between what she could survive and what she could actually want. And she was standing in that small, incredible place between the two. Trick says Ford might come out to work on the ranch this summer, she said. I heard, Harlan replied. They stood together in the last of the day's warmth. The valley stretched out before them, huge and full of life, holding everything that was still to come. This life had been forced on her. But the things she was building within it, those belonged to her. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.